Each time that you sit down to play Star Trek Adventures role-playing game, each time you begin a new campaign with your group, it's going to be a different circumstance of play, a different era. A different group of characters are going to be imagined. Different uniforms, it could be phase cannons and hull plating, or it could be quantum torpedoes and a blade of armor. But one thing will hold in common among all of those choices. There will be a ship that will be shared among those player characters. And in Star Trek Adventures, that ship is not only home, but it's also a character unto itself. It's got a sheet. It's got a whole host of things that describe it. And just like in Star Trek, a ship is not a weapon of war, first and foremost. It is your companion and the instrument that you're going to use to overcome many kinds of challenges. And it's also, well, the thing that you've got to guard, or else you become homeless. I'm the Complex Games apologist, and I'm your host as we explore Star Trek Adventures role-playing game. So replicate your favorite beverage, have a seat, and let's take a look at how Star Trek Adventures creates ships as characters. From routine evacuations of colonists using the transporter system, to bold attempts to stabilize stars about to go supernova using main deflector dishes and spatial folding. These sorts of large-scale tasks are the sorts of things that characters in the Star Trek universe embrace, because they have at their fingertips untold levels of technology, and they have a host of support staff ready to be called upon to try these things. The ship's character sheet has attributes and disciplines just like your character sheet. The attributes are a little bit different because not only are we describing the bones of the ship, the various systems, but we're also talking about the people aboard, the sorts of assets that you have, whether there are many lieutenants in the astrophysics section. That's the sort of question that these attributes will answer. Ships have communications, computers, sensors, structure, weapons, and engines, in the same way that your characters have fitness, presence, daring, insight, reason, and control. And each time that you try and do something with the ship, be it open hailing frequencies, or perhaps operating the transporters, each time that that happens, the ship chimes in with an assist, in the same way that one of your companions may. It gives an extra die. In the rulebook, it's suggested that one of your fellow players rolls this assist for the ship. Game Master picks a different kind of combination of systems and disciplines to bring in the ship's side of the equation. The strengths and weaknesses of various ships are manifold. They can be big or small. They can have an abundance of energy from their engines. They can have wide support staffs, or they can have nary a few beyond the player character group. And through an assemblage of everything that's on the ship's character sheet, which we'll take a look at right here, Star Trek Adventures is able to answer those questions in play, both readily and I'd say with a surprising degree of simplicity. So we will be getting into a few more of the details of what all this means on the character sheet as we explore the ship. But the process begins when the player characters sit down at the table, and it's advised that the characters get to create their ship in the same way that they create their character. Now what this means for a ship is a bit different. It begins with selecting a space frame, the bones of the ship, Excelsior class, Galaxy class, the old standby of the Constitution class, or the cutting-edge technology of the Intrepid class, represented by the person of the Voyager. From this framework of visual canon, we get the basic stat line, the year that it comes into service, and also perhaps one of its most salient traits. And we also learn the scale of the ship, which is a rough measure of how big of a hit your ship can take before things start happening on the inside, and it's also a rough measure of how many people are out there down in the lower decks that you can call upon. We'll talk about those two in just a moment. But while the various scales of ships vary widely, in Star Trek, because there is a matter-antimatter reactor, or even a gateway to a pocket dimension of subspace that's in the engine room of these ships, the scale does not prejudice their capability in combat as much as you might think. After you have selected the space frame of your vessel, The next question to ask is what role it's going to fulfill within Starfleet, because no ship leaves space dock without special outfitting for what it's meant to do. After all, as the flagship of the Federation in its many diplomatic duties, the 1701D had a lot of facilities aboard, including some unique ones for dealing with some unique species who might be hosted on board. From these two places of the space frame and the role, your ship's talents will start to take shape. Talents are sort of like feats from another role-playing game that you might be familiar with. But because their reach is so wide across everything that the player character group is going to be doing with their ship, it's very exciting to talk about what's going to differentiate your ship from others. And the number of talents that a ship has never balloons out of control. It's limited by the ship's scale. Finally, ships are refitted as they grow older. New technologies and new computers and new doctrines are introduced to allow ships to continue service well into their 50s and 60s. The Excelsior class, after all, was commonly seen in the Next Generation era, and the Miranda class was not long out of service. After all, there were many vessels that were seen in a derelict state in the early seasons of that show. Refits are a simple matter of buffing up the statistics, the attributes of a ship, so that they're more in line with contemporary vessels. They don't have access to the really advanced new technologies like ablative armor or quantum torpedoes, but they can hold their own. And I would say that generally speaking, a refitted ship that's well into its middle or older years is likely to have a more well-balanced disposition and fewer weak spots. To give you an idea of the scales of various vessels, a 1 is small craft like shuttlecraft and the like. 2 is runabouts, or very small vessels like the Archer-class Scout. And that's just my personal opinion. 3 is frigate-sized vessels like the Defiant. And 4 is starting to get into light cruisers like the Connie or the Intrepid. 5 are big ships, like the Excelsior, that are meant to really carry the role of a ship of the line. And 6 are flagships and behemoths, the Doritix-class warbirds, and of course, Galaxy-class ships. Now I'm sure you're chomping at the bit to hear how ships work in combat. But before we dive into that, let's just talk about power. Power is a quantity, a set of tokens, a lot like momentum and threat, that your ship generates based on its engine score. Now, the main use of power is, of course, in combat and for doing actions on the bridge besides. But there's a lot more to power. You might not see it much in live plays of the game, and it's something that I haven't heard a lot about people using. But it's a really powerful thing you can do anytime you're taking an action with the ship. Now, we differentiate in Star Trek Adventures between actions aboard ship, like talking to your fellow crewmen, trying to get someone who's a bit intractable, like Reginald Barclay, to get back to work, or acting with the ship, as in beep booping on your control panels to activate the main deflector dish, that sort of thing. And when you take actions aboard ship, you don't get to use power, but when you're acting with the ship, you do. For each point of power that you spend, if you're successful, you generate an extra momentum. It does increase the complication range of your task, and those complications are supposed to be reflected as systems going offline and things like that. But with that being said, it's a great way to keep your group in good supply of momentum, so that anytime a crisis hits, you are close to that cap of 6, and you have an abundance of momentum to spend on obtain information. Because after all, protagonists in Star Trek are never short of knowledge of the problem that's before them. And when they are, that's when crisis starts to hit. So use your ship's power. That's just a little hot idea. I wouldn't call it a tip yet because I haven't experienced it yet. But I do know that it's a resource that is going unspent. Now I'm sure you're chomping at the bit to hear a little bit more about how this stuff works in ship combat. The ship combat system is something that we'll delve into in greater depth in its own video. And it's something that allows each person to sit on their chair on the bridge and take their own turn doing various things like modulating the shields, assigning damage control teams, or taking evasive action. And of course, from the captain's chair, he can direct the various people to get up and go. Just like in many combat systems, there's a health pool or track. And in Star Trek Adventures, that's the ship's shields, which come from its structure statistic, along with security, which represents its armaments and its readiness for combat. When ships run out of shields, they start taking breaches internally, which affect the 6 systems which are inside. And for each of those, as things start to go offline and limitations start to come into play, there are things to deal with, and the ship's ability to carry on in the fight starts to diminish. This is one of the places where I feel that the ship combat system is very strong, because it encourages sort of that naval combat aspect that we see so often in the series, where ships are retiring from the field when they don't have any more fight in them. It's a system where existential combat, straight to the death, is not what you will see. Instead, the captain will say, "Can we go to warp?" And then the drama will be about escaping. Now, breaches don't only happen when you're all out of shields. They can also happen when 5 or more damage is dealt. Now, 5 or more damage, that's after the ship's resistance. There's a basic ability for a larger ship to stand up to a blow. That's sort of like its damage reduction, and that's represented by its scale. It can get tweaked a little bit from there, but essentially, every time a Galaxy-class starship is shot at, it has to take at least 6 points of damage for anything to happen at all. Otherwise, it's a glancing blow. Now, sooner or later, we're going to have to talk about the special dice that Star Trek Adventures uses whenever damage or moving down a work track in extended tasks comes into play. So let's talk about it right now. The challenge die is in the shape of a normal D6. 2 faces are blank and don't count for anything. 2 faces have a 1 plus effect, which I'll talk about in a moment. Another face has a 1 only, and a 6th face is just a 2. So, between 1 and 2, right? Well, an effect can trigger various things. One example of an effect in ship-to-ship combat that you might see is when you're reducing the resistance of the ship that you're shooting at. Another example might be that when you roll an effect, it's just an additional point of damage. Each of these effects has its own keyword, and allows you to have various things happening with different kinds of weapon without picking up different kinds of dice. There's this one unique, interesting kind of die, and it creates very interesting ranges of numbers, even though it's just a d6 and it's only got between 0 and 2 on the face. Counting up large buckets of dice and trying to sum them is something that I've always gotten tired of in tabletop role-playing games. And I'm very thankful that the quantities are small and meaningful. So to give you a brief total picture of the ship-to-ship combat system, each character gets a turn. They select an action that relates to the station that they are at on the bridge. And they spend power, if they need to do that action. And then they roll with assistance from the ship, and then, if successful, they might spend additional momentum to change the result a little bit. And if it was an attack, they'll roll the challenge dice. They'll apply that damage first to the enemy's resistance, and then to the enemy's shields. And if they did 5 or more damage, a breach will happen on the inside of the enemy ship. You can pick out a system to target, and you don't have to roll for locations. Of course, if you forgot, you would roll. And so it goes. A character goes on board your ship, and then one of the enemy ships takes a turn representing someone sitting on the bridge of their ship, and back and forth it goes. You can spend determination or momentum to short-circuit this order and take 2 turns in a row for your ship. And so it goes back and forth until one side usually will choose to retire. Of course, if your structure is breached or your engines and your warp core becomes critical, then things are more dire. When you want to run away, the helmsman sends the ship to warp and spends an amount of power that will be an auction versus anyone chasing them. Now, I've only run a couple skirmishes myself and a few encounters with nasty space weather using these combat rules. But from what I understand from knockdown drag-out fights as people have run them, it doesn't run more than 3 rounds, and it's nice and quick. And ships' capabilities degrade quickly, and the writing gets on the wall. Who needs to get away, fight for their survival, rather than fight for the objective, it's a refreshing change of pace from what we normally see in tabletop role-playing games, where we fight each other until we're dead. Now that would not make for a very fun story in Star Trek, because normally we like to tune in next week for another picture of the same vessel, and the same crew, getting together to explore more of that vast undiscovered country called space. So I hope this whets your appetite a little bit. Let's round things out by introducing you to the USS Endeavour, an Excelsior-class ship that my players created together. They picked out the talents for the ship, and the unique abilities and the character of that vessel through refits and talents started to come through during our premiere episode. One of the things is that sensor tasks are one easier with this. Now that seems relatively droll, right? Well, using the transporter is a sensor task, and -1 difficulty while using the transporters opens up a lot of doors, as a matter of fact. Another thing about the Endeavour is that she has lots of power lying around through her auxiliary impulse reactors. And that opens the door to using power for non-combat spends to generate all that momentum to obtain information and other things on the table. And finally, the Endeavour has increased resistance. While it's only scale 5, it's got resistance 6, which makes it harder to breach, which means that she might take a hit and not take any breaches a little bit more often for a ship of her size. This means that because the player group doesn't have an engineer among them, those extended tasks and other various difficulties that might come from breaches are something that hopefully they'll be able to deal with a little bit less often. So I hope this is fascinating, how ships differentiate themselves from each other, and how the ship is sort of, I think, a nice, fun, concise, and simple shared character among the players. We'll talk about the whole world of ship-to-ship combat in a future video, but I wanted to introduce you to how the ship behaves as a character in actual play in Star Trek Adventures role-playing game, because I think it's a lot of fun, and it really pulls in that genre feeling that I think 2-die-20 system games really strive towards. And in this case, I think it's a resounding success. So that wraps up our 5th video about Star Trek Adventures role-playing game. I hope that you're starting to get a clearer picture of why this game is so exciting to me, and hopefully starting to become exciting to you, and you're getting some new and interesting ideas about how you'd like to play it. In the meantime, happy gaming. I'm the Complex Games Apologist.